Welcome back to the leading edge of integrative mental health. I'm your host, Lisa Dale Miller. Please review and subscribe to the Groundless Ground podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, YouTube, radio.com, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and of course find out more at groundlessground.com. I'm ready to go. How about you? Are non-human animals conscious? Do non-human animal minds have concepts, intelligence, memory, intentionality, ethics, and sociality? Kristin Andrews, professor of philosophy, author, and pioneering researcher in moral cognition, discusses non-human animal consciousness and the ethical problems of using non-human animals like rats as research subjects. To celebrate the newly released second edition of Kristin's seminal textbook, The Animal Mind, we dive deep into philosophical inquiry on animals and consciousness, how and what animals think, what skills they possess, what moral and social structures they create and live by. And throughout our conversation, Kristin tackles the minefield of ethical questions regarding animal rights and the use of animals in scientific and medical research. Kristin also candidly describes how she conquered obstacles most women face navigating and succeeding in the largely male-dominated world of academic philosophy. This episode will broaden your perspective on our animal brothers and sisters and really give you a sense of how closely related we truly are. Kristin Andrews, it is really a tremendous pleasure to have you on the Groundless Ground podcast.
I'm so happy to be here, Lisa. Thank you so much for the invitation.
My listeners always get very excited when I have philosophers on. This is going to be a really interesting conversation because I would say you're probably one of the foremost experts in the philosophy of animal minds.
Yeah, it's not a very big field right now in philosophy, but there are so many young people who are interested in it, and I'm super excited about how it's growing. We have postdocs in Vienna and new faculty positions in the UK, the Society for the Philosophy of Animal Minds in North America. So I think that we'll see more and more philosophers interested in questions about animal minds, and I'm very excited about that.
Your seminal textbook, The Animal Mind, has a second edition that is coming out. I'm very excited. It's really a fantastic book. And even though this is a textbook, I found it a fascinating read.
I wanted people to enjoy reading it. I want my students to actually do the reading. And so I tried to write it in a way that would grip people with stories and anecdotes, and then deconstructing the anecdotes, because everybody loves to tell smart animal stories. And we love watching videos of crows sledding down snowy roofs and the octopus with the coconut shell and these things. But when we start inquiring what these videos tell us about what's going on in the minds of the animals, things get really complicated, but really interesting. And so I thought I'd start the whole book with these sorts of anecdotes because everybody's seen them. Everyone's seen these videos.
Maybe that's why there's so many young people coming into the field, because YouTube has been animal philosophy's best friend, really.
Yeah, it's true. I've had students who've been interested in figuring out how to use all of these videos on YouTube as data. One video, you have no idea what the past history of the animal was. But if you see video after video of crows sledding around the world, presumably they're not learning it from one another. You can start drawing inferences from accumulated videos on YouTube. I don't know of anyone who's actually done this yet, but I think it is a ripe research project for someone who's looking for one.
Would you mind giving the listeners a sense of how you got into all of this? You have a very interesting history. It is difficult to be a philosopher, number one. It's even more difficult probably to be a woman in the philosophy world because it's so male-oriented.
I did start out in philosophy, but I was always a weird philosopher who studied animal minds. So my undergraduate degree was in philosophy from Antioch College, and we had co-ops where we were supposed to spend half the year doing something in the world. The other half the year we'd spend in the classroom. So experiential ed before experiential ed was cool. And one of my co-ops, my last co-op, in fact, was at Dolphin Lab. Lou Herman had a dolphin cognition and communication lab in Honolulu. And this was pre-internet. This was the early 90s. And it was very hard to find scientists who would be willing to answer my, typed out letters posted through the mail. But he did. And so I learned about how the scientists are actually doing the science of dolphin communication, symbolic communication, memory research, imitation. So there was some interesting social research that was going on at the time. And while I was there, ended up being, my visit was the year between my BA and my MA, which were both in philosophy. I was trying to figure out, can I be a philosopher and still be engaged in this important research that the scientists are doing on animal minds? Or should I go and get an MA in psychology instead? And I thought that the kinds of questions I was interested in asking were quite different from the kinds of questions that the scientists were asking, and that there was a place for these two different methodological approaches for really getting at what's going on with animals and what it means to us that we have all these different minds and psychologies around us on the planet. And so I stayed in philosophy. I was always a weird oddball. I was dolphin girl during my PhD program. And then later, when I got my first jobs and I started working with orangutans, I was orangutan girl. The philosophers didn't understand why I was going out into the field and into the lab and really engaging with scientists. When I was on the job market in the early 2000s, the first question I would always get in job interviews is, why is this philosophy? Using the halo effect, as my supervisor Ron Geary advised me, I said, "Oh, I do philosophy the way Dan Dennett does philosophy." And then people said, "Oh, okay, that sounds good." And so I smuggled my way into a couple philosophy departments.
It's funny, the first question I've written down for you to answer is, what is the field of philosophy of animal minds, and why is it useful or relevant in an age of cognitive neuroscience?
Maybe I began to answer that, but I can say a bit more. For one thing, when scientists are doing science, they're always making assumptions, right? You're not going to be able to do any sort of science without having a whole bunch of philosophical assumptions on the table. So take, for example, consciousness or theory of mind. You say, this is what I'm going to actually investigate. In the case of consciousness, what you might be investigating is something like access consciousness instead of phenomenal consciousness. Access consciousness, whether or not inputs get picked up by other parts of the system and used in decision making and behavior and so on and so forth, that's often studied and called consciousness, whereas you might not be getting any information at all about sentience or what it feels like for an animal to be experiencing those inputs or engaging in those behaviors. Scientists in theory of mind, for example, will make assumptions about theory of mind as just passing the false belief task. So whatever it is that makes a chimpanzee pass a false belief task is theory of mind. Since Chris Crupegne and colleagues found that chimpanzees can pass a false belief test, they have a theory of mind, raises questions about then what is a theory of mind? And those are questions that philosophers have investigated. So we're really at a level of doing conceptual analysis and trying to figure out what these concepts mean, what the mechanisms are looking like when they're appealed to by scientists. So I often will read a scientific paper that discusses cognitive mechanisms that in fact aren't cognitive mechanisms, they're descriptions of behavior. It's important also to keep distinct what counts as a mechanism, right? Something that causes the output as opposed to a phenomenon that we're uncovering. Uncovering phenomenon is so important. We haven't been doing this with animals because we haven't been paying enough attention to non-human animals. So much important work is happening in just recognizing that these things are going on. For example, monkeys in temples in Bali in India steal things from tourists, but don't steal things from the local people. And when they steal things from tourists, they go to local people and ask to trade some valuable food item for this meaningless phone or sunglasses. They don't care about that. They care about the food. So this is a pattern of behavior that is so interesting, but we don't know what the mechanism is. Once we know the pattern is there, we can then ask these really interesting questions about how monkeys think about this. Are they thinking about this as an economy? Are they recognizing that some humans value different items differently, that phones will get them a bigger reward than just a water bottle? I think there are lots of interesting questions that come about from this work that scientists do looking and uncovering patterns of behavior, but we aren't yet answering questions about mechanism just by describing the behavior. So that's another thing philosophers can do, is clarify what sorts of research questions are actually being answered, what sorts of research questions are on the table, and what other sorts of research questions we could be asking in light of the interesting research that gets published in all these great science journals.
I just want to go through a couple of terms before we get into the really interesting stuff, like whether animals have memory and language and all those interesting things. In order to answer those questions, you laid a beautiful framework. For instance, you name a few things that might bias an animal cognitive researcher. Anthropomorphism is one, anti-anthropomorphism is another, and anthropectomy is a third. Maybe you could elaborate on these three terms, because I think it will help listeners to understand how complex all the questions we're about to go talk about might be when you do this with non-human animals.
Okay, sure. I'm happy to. There is a lot of jargon that gets confusing, I think. Anthropocentrism is another term that often pops up that is distinguished from anthropomorphism. So I can add that into the mix. Anthropomorphism is a term that people often use as a critique of certain explanations of animal behavior. So if you just think of anthropomorphism as a term in and of itself, it means the attribution of human properties to non-humans. But of course, there are lots of properties that humans have that are shared by non-humans, and not just non-human animals, but like other objects in the world or other alive things in the world. Anthropomorphism, when it's used as a critique, usually means the attribution of a human psychological property, like a belief or a desire, way of being in the world, like having friends or being a moral agent, when those attributions aren't justified. So when someone says that's an anthropomorphic attribution, what they mean is, I think that's a false attribution. I try to translate how, when people say that's anthropomorphic, into, I think that's wrong. And then we can investigate whether or not that attribution is true or not, and put aside this question about whether the property is human unique or not, which begs the question about whether the attribution is right or wrong. So anti-anthropomorphism is what I describe in another little book that's going to be coming out later this year, How to Study Animal Minds. I describe anti-anthropomorphism as the logical principle. One of the goals of comparative psychology is to kind of retrain yourself, your kind of natural desire or inclination that one might have when they go into studying animals, to see animals as doing things the way humans would do things. And this is useful, of course, because as a scientist, you shouldn't just go and look at an animal, be it a human infant or a chimpanzee or a rat, and say, oh, look, they're trying to get at the strawberry. They love strawberries. Strawberries are delicious, aren't they? Because you like strawberries. That's just a bad scientific methodology, no matter who your subject is, whether it's a human or a non-human. But the anti-anthropomorphism as a methodological principle sometimes gets exaggerated in the case in comparative psychology, so that students sometimes get, I think, discouraged from asking questions about properties that might be deemed anthropomorphic by critics, like friendship in animals or investigating economies in macaque monkeys who might be stealing things from Balinese temples. The next term, anthropectomy, is my favorite because I coined this term with my partner, Brian Huss, and we spent a lot of time trying to figure out the best term that would reflect the opposite bias of anthropomorphism. So just as anthropomorphism is a critique, anthropectomy is a critique as well. So it is the refusal to attribute human properties to non-human animals when those properties should be attributed to the animal. It's cutting out a property that an animal actually has because that property is thought to be somehow sacred or special or human unique. And this is the opposite bias that didn't have a very good name. Franz de Waal called it anthropodenial, which was clunky and awkward. So we thought anthropectomy, we've got the Greek right at least on anthropectomy. But it needs a real word because it is a real problem in the field. And if you can name something, I think it helps to identify the issue when it arises. The fourth term, the one I introduced into our conversation, is anthropocentrism. And anthropocentrism is taking humans to be the center of the world. So when we look at other animals, we might also be committing another problem in thinking that if they're not just like us, they're somehow less interesting or less important. That there's nothing cognitively interesting going on if they're not cognitive in the same way we are. And this anthropocentrism also leads to certain problems in science if it limits us from investigating different ways of being in the world, different ways of solving problems that animals might have. So, for example, humans have a tiny bit of echolocation ability. So humans can echolocate, but we're terrible at it, right? We're really bad at it. We're not like bats or dolphins. But we can train ourselves to kind of feel how big a space is in. If we close our eyes and click our tongues, we can come to understand a little bit about space through sound. Other animals are great at it. And if we ignore those senses that the other animals have, or we don't even notice that, say, an animal has a sensory system that allows it to sense magnetism or electrical activity, we're thinking about those other animals in terms of the sensory capacities we have, not in terms of the sensory capacities that they actually have.
Sometimes I think, especially psychologists and cognitive neuroscientists who are doing research and using animals as research subjects to either learn more about humans or to develop drugs or whatever it is, that they might tend toward this kind of bias in human supremacy. So they don't really have to go close to the ethics of doing harm to a being that basically they're not ascribing attributes, which they would ascribe to a human that would make them never do that research on a human.
Yeah. I have a recent article with Susanna Monceau on research on rats. Rats are a ubiquitous research subject in biomedical research as well as in cognition research. And they're ubiquitous in the US because there are no welfare protection on rats. Rats are not even deemed animals under welfare laws. But the research that's being done on rats, some of it at least, is being used to find treatments for human psychopathologies, for treatments of human trauma. In order to engage in that research, scientists are, first of all, discovering that rats have empathic capacities, that rats will be willing to sacrifice themselves in order to help free a trapped rat. So scientists are engaging in interventions in rats in order to impair their natural empathic capacities, in order to see what they can do to repair those empathic capacities, create treatments for humans. So Susanna Monceau and I argue in an article that appears in Aeon magazine, this is a real moral challenge to the science. And it's a moral challenge that has to be acknowledged and is not being acknowledged at all. We liken it to the research that Harry Harlow did on monkeys. These experiments are famous. Baby monkeys were taken from their moms, given wire monkeys that produced milk, and given cloth monkeys that didn't produce any milk. And Harlow and his students found that the monkeys preferred to hang on to the cloth monkeys. They preferred something that approximated a relationship to something that gave them nutrition. And his goal was to aid in discoveries that would help humans, that would help mental disorders. People have largely decried that research program. The amount of harm that was done to the animals, the challenges to autonomy as well as the welfare harms.
A lot of my colleagues at this moment would probably say to you, well, if it wasn't for that research, we really wouldn't have the kinds of theories and methodologies that are now treating attachment disorders.
Susanna and I don't make any blanket claims in our article about rats that we should stop all rat research. We do not make that claim at all in the paper. What we argue is that these moral costs are real, just like the moral costs were real in Harlow's research, and they must be acknowledged, and we should be considering them. Rats shouldn't be excluded from ethics review boards. If we decide we should do it, we should acknowledge what we're doing and be honest to ourselves.
So we probably need to take a moment to talk about folk psychology.
Sure.
Because it's interesting. It's a slur word, I think, in the science world, not in philosophy. In your textbook, you actually redeem this word and almost really use this word as a basis for bolstering your argument for animal consciousness.
The problem, I think, is that in the sciences, folk psychology is what the scientists are trying to avoid because they're trying to do scientific psychology, just like physicists don't like folk physics. They're trying to do scientific physics. But in philosophy, when we use the term folk psychology, what we're doing is just talking about social cognition, how humans understand other humans in our daily interaction with other humans. And the fact that humans aren't the only social creatures means that there's some kind of folk psychology in the sense of social psychology for other social creatures. And so if we investigate the common sense psychology that humans have and that other species have, and we look at the concepts that we use when we're understanding other people, concepts about the simplest everyday things like desire or sensation, or even more complicated terms that psychologists also like to talk about, memory. Our folk psychology starts with concepts that make their way into scientific psychology. Psychologists did not discover that memory exists. The folk, we discovered that memory exists just by interacting with each other. We've known this forever. We don't have the first recorded discovery of memory. The same goes with emotions and sentience and so on. So our scientific psychology starts on this very rich understanding of other humans. And acknowledging that, I think, is very important for comparative psychology because it's a very rich basis that we don't have when it comes to many other species of animals. We haven't grown up with them. We haven't nurtured them as children. We haven't fallen in love with them. We don't try to buy groceries from them. Right? Our daily interactions with, say, spiders and chimpanzees and dolphins are very different from our daily interactions with human beings. And so acknowledging a different starting position, I think, is very important. And investigating what sorts of assumptions we are allowing into human sciences is very important for understanding the methodologies in comparative psychology.
We should talk a little bit about whether or not there's a hierarchy of worthy animals. I mean, when you talk about consciousness, again, nobody knows what consciousness is.
Right.
Maybe you could just do us all a favor and give us a definition of what is consciousness.
When I use the word consciousness, I use it to refer to the feelingness, the phenomenology of our experience with the world. So examples would be the smell of freshly cut grass, or the feel of the sun on your skin, or the emotional response to a bad dream that you have. That's consciousness. Those are the things that I'm referring to.
Those are the things we can't really know whether animals have.
We can't really know that other humans have them either. What we can do is listen to the things other humans say, like, oh, this wine is delicious, or I had a scary dream last night. But for all we know, they're a phenomenological zombie not experiencing anything. Now, of course, we don't treat anybody like phenomenological zombies. We couldn't have evolved as a species if we did. It's a basic premise to our way of being in the world. Just like physicists can't prove that there is material in the world.
Yeah.
Radical skepticism could be true, but you don't see a physicist worrying at all about whether or not there is matter. Just like I think psychologists don't worry at all whether or not there's psychology. But for some reason, when it comes to phenomenal consciousness, people get scared. People should be no more scared about phenomenal consciousness as they are about the external world. Now, once we take these as a given, then we can ask, what is it about other humans that makes us take them to be conscious? Scientists can ask that. Philosophers can ask that. And we can come up with markers for consciousness that are not anthropocentric, that are not only relevant to our interactions with other humans. We can also look at our natural taking of our dogs to be conscious and say, what is it about our dogs that makes us think our dogs are conscious? And we can get farther away from the human case. And those might give us new markers that we can apply to animals that are outside of mammals. What is it that takes a pet owner who plays with their bearded dragon to think that their bearded dragon is conscious? And we can continue a version of an expanding circle in order to look at species that are very different from us, that aren't making eye contact with puppy dog eyes or have cute little facial expressions, in order to find evidence that they have this family resemblance that all animals seem to have. All animals that we've investigated so far seem to have certain markers suggesting that they should be treated as conscious. Now, do we have definitive proof? No. Do we have an empirical way of testing whether or not we're warranted, and to what degree we're warranted to accept species as conscious? I think that we do. But it's going to take this work of developing these markers in this expanded circle sense in order to know how justified we are in accepting for now the premise that, say, the Portia spider is conscious, compared to how justified we are in accepting the bearded dragon is conscious.
I feel like theory of mind, the capacity, it's so assumptive in us, right? So it's the capacity that when I meet another human being, I am just assuming it's so bottom up that they are like me, they can understand what I'm saying, their mind works similarly to me. Empathic connection that's already implicit in theory of mind itself, and it's so assumptive. So on the one hand, I'm hearing you say there needs to be a widening of consciousness to other sentient beings.
Right. Yeah, I think that if we take life in general, we see a lot of interesting arguments these days about in life you're going to see consciousness, and that some of the markers that are being identified, Ginsburg and Jablonka's unlimited associative learning account of consciousness, that you see this many different animal species. It's sufficient, it's not necessary, they're saying. If you want to look at why consciousness evolved, we might see some reason for thinking that consciousness evolved to go towards things that are good for us and away for things that are bad for us. And that's it. Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, then we shouldn't be surprised if we find markers of consciousness widely dispersed in the animal and the plant kingdom. So I don't think that we're making any kind of theoretical missteps by taking this, what I would call more of an epistemological status towards consciousness in other animals. We have certain reason for accepting animals as conscious. If we go about with that premise, not that we've figured it out or have an answer, it's going to change the way not only we can do science and affect some of our scientific results. And there's data on this, that if you treat a research subject in certain ways, you're going to get different results out of them. Just like if you treat humans different way, you're going to get different results out of them. But the science will be improved by treating other animals as sentient, as I should say, as conscious. But also, I think that we'll make moral progress if we treat other animals as conscious, because then we can really be asking these questions about the risks that we may be taking, not just in research, but in all of our daily activities that involve animals. Building on land that animals are living on, to what our policy should be with regard to reproductive capacity in sanctuary situations, to zoos, to all of that work will be enriched by considering that we have reason to think that they're conscious.
Let's go into the cool stuff. Not that this hasn't been cool. For me, I'm geeky, so I found all this very cool. Do you think the experience of pain is a good indicator of whether animals are conscious?
Yeah, I think that pain behavior that's ameliorated by treatments with analgesics is also really good evidence that the animals are actually experiencing some pain, and that there are some similarities in pain pathways between humans and these non-human beings. I think this other research that looks at how well animals learn when they're experiencing pain or when they're exposed to aversive stimuli is also very interesting. But of course, it's not definitive, because it could just be a complete physiological response. You're repairing your cell damage when these aversives are affecting you. So you're not going to get a knockdown argument. You're going to get some suggestive evidence that these animals might feel something. Taken alone, if all I knew was that analgesics work to modify a quote unquote pain behavior in a system, that wouldn't be enough for me to think that that organism was conscious. We could create something like that perhaps, right? Just like we can create many robots that can mimic emotional responses, like Pero the seal, purr when you pet it, and so on. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make me think that Pero the seal feels anything. But it's the host of different properties taken together that reinforce one another that I think gives us good reason for accepting the premise that that animal is conscious.
Like I'm even thinking, for instance, a paramecium would go toward something it needs. It's basically a single cell organism. So
Yep.
you can't really ascribe need to it other than the need to survive.
Yep. So we have one marker of consciousness in the paramecium, and that is that it goes towards things it needs and presumably away from things that are harmful.
Is that a marker of aliveness as a biological creature, or is it a marker of consciousness?
So I think it's a marker of both. So if you want to compare the paramecium to the bearded dragon, let's say, not a mammal, so people don't often talk about reptiles. We'll talk about reptiles and paramecium. You see that the bearded dragon has so much richer set of behavioral markers and chemical markers. You see the same sort of hormones in the bearded dragon that you see in human beings, identified with emotional responses. You see cortisol, you see all of these sorts of things in bearded dragons. You do not see them in paramecium. You see one marker going towards things they need and away from things that harm them. That's something. That's more than, say, what my pencil has. So I think it's important to think about the degrees of evidence we have for different species and not ever say, we're going to draw the line here. This is the minded thing and this is the conscious thing and this is the thing that isn't conscious. I don't think that we have any evidence to justify any line drawing practices. But what we do have is degrees of credence in hypotheses about the consciousness of different sorts of systems. We have a lot more for humans than we have for dogs. But I think that our credence level for dogs is high enough to just say, yeah, dogs are conscious. We have a lot more for dogs than we have for bearded dragons. But I still think we have enough for bearded dragons to just say, yeah, bearded dragons are conscious. We have a lot more for bearded dragons than we have for paramecium. But I wouldn't say, yeah, paramecium are conscious. We have more reason to think that paramecium are conscious than we have to think my pencil is conscious. And that's where we leave it, at this epistemic claim.
How many times have I heard over the years, dogs and cats have no memory? On the other hand, in a folk psychology way, I can definitely report that the cat I lived with for 21 years definitely had a memory.
Right. Or why we think that our pets love us, because they act with such overwhelming emotion when we come home from work at the end of the day. In the case of the dog, maybe not the cat. So I got a dog for the very first time, who is now our second child. He'll be a year old next week.
Mm-hmm.
And he will do some things for me he won't do for anyone else. He has a very different relationship with each member of the family. And I've learned so much from him, from raising him from being a little 12-week-old to an almost year-old now. Just like I learned so much after my daughter was born. There's so much you learn from this on-the-ground experience. So I'm developing what I would call folk expertise with dogs in general by developing this kind of folk expertise with Riddle, my little puppy. And I felt the same way with my daughter. A few months after she was born, one of my colleagues who's very skeptical about animal minds said, well, now that you have a kid, don't you think that obviously humans are much smarter than non-human animals? And I said, oh, no, on the contrary. I'm learning so much about how humans are not very good at things, how hard it is to get 3-month-old, 4-month-old to do the simplest thing, like pay attention, and how weirdly connected we are in this very physiological way, because I was nursing her. And this very interesting bodily connection that we had, I thought has been completely underexplored in social cognition.
How about language? Humans are so anthropomorphic about language. We just think language is words. Animals have all kinds of different sorts of language. So can you talk a little bit about research on language and how animals communicate, not just with us, but with each other, more importantly, I think?
If you were to Google animal language research, you'd probably come up with the grade 8 animal language research programs. And those were designed to create an interface so that great apes could communicate with human great apes. That's a real oversight. I mean, this research was really interesting. We did learn a lot about these animals. I think most of the people who worked with those great apes would say this research should never happen again because it requires taking an animal away from their mother and raising them in a human context. What I think is really interesting is the burgeoning interest in communication systems that non-human animals use with one another. We sometimes don't pay attention to those communication systems because we don't notice them, because we can't hear the sounds the animals are making, or we don't see the movements, or we can't smell the scents that the animals are creating and picking up on. And so I think it is our anthropocentrism that makes us think other species aren't communicating when they are signaling and picking up signals all the time. So, of course, the famous case is with dogs and checking their pee mail, as Mark Beckhoff has it, right? The messages these dogs are sending to one another through their urine is, we don't know. We don't know the content of these messages. Dog trainers will tell you a lot about the body languages that dogs use to communicate with one another. I've been in the past year trying to learn the body language of dogs so that I can understand what my dog is saying to me and to other dogs that he's interacting with in a dog park. Another example is in rats. We didn't realize that rats were vocalizing laughter until we heard they were chirping subsonically, right? So it's not, we can't pick it up with the naked ear, but we have to have the right instruments to hear rats laugh. If we ask a question as scientists and philosophers, we ask the question, what is the communication system of this species like? We're already assuming they're communicating. But if as scientists we're trained not to think about other animals as communicators, or not to think about other animals as social beings, but just as individual cognitive machines, then we're never going to figure out how they communicate. It's a shift in thinking about non-human animals to motivate the research programs that will allow us to understand more and more about communication systems. Elephants is another case in point, right? So this long distance communication that elephants are doing subsonically through feeling vibrations on their feet seems to be a communication system that scientists are picking up on. So I think we're just at the beginning of this really exciting research. And Eva Meyer has a new book coming out on animal languages that I'm looking forward to.
If we go back to hierarchy, one of the things humans ascribe to their species and no other species are things like autonoetic consciousness and things like concepts and beliefs and intentionality. How do we figure out whether or not non-human animals think and possess these qualities of thinking? They're even hard for us, frankly,
Right. That's right,
to describe in ourselves.
It's actually useful to look at some of the infant literature in some cases in testing these, because infants don't speak either. So you want to find evidence of, say, mental time travel in a system that doesn't speak. What do you do in order to figure out whether they're reenacting their past or experientially imagining their future? The sorts of things that we do with adults, as we say, oh, go back and walk around your house in your mind and count the windows in your house, right? And that requires language. So it just requires, I think, in order to test these in other species, requires us to try to, first of all, get outside our anthropocentric linguistic framework and ask, in what kind of context would it be relevant for this animal or the baby to engage in autonoesis or reimagining an experience that you've already had, and can create something like the spoon test. Tolvig had this spoon test for mental time travel. It was a folk tale. A child was having a dream every night about this delicious party with cakes, but she didn't have any spoons to eat the cakes with. And so one night she planned ahead of time and picked up a spoon to take to bed. You can get at this question by asking whether corvids plan for their future meals, as Nikki Clayton and other scientists have done. And they find that, yeah, you know what? The corvids do, in fact, plan for their breakfast tomorrow. They'll engage in different sorts of behavior in caching food that they know will still be fresh in the morning, as opposed to food that they prefer that won't be fresh in the morning, if they know that they're going to be able to access this area in the morning. In a sense, giving some evidence that they are experiencing what it's going to be like the next day when they uncache the peanut that's still going to be there, rather than the worm that's going to be a little bit rotten. Now, again, we're not seeing directly that the corvid is experiencing tomorrow's breakfast, but we're getting at the kind of evidence that psychologists are using when it comes to the human case in the non-human animal case. One of the critiques of communication research in non-human animals is that, well, humans engage in intentional communication, but what these other animals are doing is just kind of biological communication. They're sending out signals, and these signals are causing effects in them, but they're not intending to send out these signals. But one of the ways we test for intentional communication in humans is we look for responses to failed communications. We look for suppressed signaling in some cases. We look for cognitive flexibility. And we do find evidence of cognitive flexibility in the case of communication in non-human animals as well. So for example, I did this research with Anne Russin. We're working with orangutans who would just gesture to us to ask for things. And if we pretended like we didn't know what they wanted, they would elaborate much more dramatically. Even in one case, Checheb picked a leaf off the ground and rubbed it on his head before handing it to Anne as a request that Anne rubs dirt off Checheb's head. That these elaborated responses, communicative responses, are evidence of intentional communication, not just mechanistic signal that's being mechanistically taken up by a communicative partner. We have ways of testing for what concepts non-human animals have that once we've already granted that they are cognitive systems, we can then find differences in, say, concept A versus concept B that will allow us to get at which concepts these different species might have.
So when an animal that you described getting some fresh food and then is hiding it or storing it in a particular way so that it maintains its freshness, that requires, first of all, the concept, this is a food, the concept, this is fresh food as opposed to not fresh food. The concept, if I store, that storing is actually a process concept. If I store, then fresh will remain. So that's time in the future. So that's time travel in a way. It has an actual belief. And all of this ostensibly is centered around the basic emotional need to survive. So I don't see how that sounds very different than what we do as humans, except we may do it in a much more sophisticated way.
Just as I hesitate in thinking that humans are unique in a lot of these cognitive capacities that I think are widely shared, I also hesitate to underestimate the differences between species. There are things that we do that no other animals do, like have this conversation. But there's so many things that other animals do that we don't do. What I think that we have evidence for in the corvid case with the planning for breakfast is we have reason to think that corvids are able to represent information about what, where, and when. We have some reason for thinking that they might have concepts that relate to what, food, breakfast, or something along those lines, tomorrow's meal. But as soon as we start getting into what exactly those concepts are, we already run into problems. Like, do they really have a concept for breakfast? Is there a concept for breakfast like our concept for breakfast? Or what about tomorrow's meal? Oh, do they have a concept of tomorrow? So we have to be a little bit careful to not go too quickly to say, oh, the animals have all of these concepts, because those are the concepts that we're using when we use language to describe what's going on. But the concept of food, we have pretty good evidence that the corvids do have that concept because they can discriminate food from non-food items. They can treat something as food and then learn that they were wrong about that. These are the sorts of things that give us reason for thinking that they have that concept. Fresh, it's not clear that they have a concept fresh that maps onto our concept of fresh. I think it's an interesting research proposal. I think it's a hypothesis that's warranted right now, but we'd need to do more research to figure out whether they actually have a concept that maps onto the concept we have when we use the word fresh.
It could be as simple as fresh, meaning it doesn't make me sick. And that is the oldest thing. Because our prime directive is survival, we would have adapted and created the capacity to know poisonous food very early on, so we didn't die.
Absolutely. And I think that this kind of evolutionary perspective is a very useful one in developing hypotheses for the kinds of concepts that we think that non-human animals might have. Breakfast? Probably not. Food that doesn't kill me? Probably yes. Whether they distinguish between vomiting and sickness, who knows? As a research program, it's extremely rich to start with these very basic, reproductive partner, offspring in species that have maternal care or paternal care for that matter, food and poison, predators, the basic concepts, and then build up from there. Because presumably we're going to find that there are some concepts that some species have that are kind of surprising that we wouldn't have expected. Do bowerbirds who make these elaborate structures, male bowerbirds develop these really beautiful bowers. They decorate them with found objects, often like human trash, but also beautiful stones and feathers and sticks and so on. They use perspective, probably without knowing anything about perspective, to make themselves look really big to a female who's approaching them. Does the male bowerbird have a concept of beauty or aesthetics? Darwin thought so. Maybe, but right now we don't have evidence to go that far, right?
I kind of would agree with Darwin only in that aesthetics, even for human beings, probably developed as one of the qualities of being fit as a mate. The bowerbirds may in fact be using aesthetics in the very same way we do, because I would argue even architecture, there's some kind of ego involvement in making the kind of buildings that we make that people go wow over.
And if you make a really exciting building, your status goes up. And when your status goes up, you benefit in reproductive partners, or at least mates. So when we say aesthetic appreciation, I am stepping outside of my comfort level in philosophy because I don't do aesthetics. And that is a whole branch of philosophy. But I think the aestheticians would probably argue that aesthetics is something more than just fitness for a reproductive partner. I think it's interesting to ask then where things might be going beyond fitness in the case of non-human animals in terms of aesthetic appreciation. So what we don't know from the science of bowerbirds is whether the female bird is attending to the size of the male or the decoration of the bower. So if we could put an eye tracker on the female bowerbird and see what she's looking at, that would give us some interesting information about how she might be generalizing her aesthetic sensibility from mere fitness to, and what a pretty building.
Well, this takes us to culture and social norms.
Yes, it's a topic that I've been recently really interested in. People ask me, so what is it that makes humans different from other animals? I don't know if there is something that makes humans different from other animals. The response I usually get back is, well, but we're the only ethical being, right? It's only humans who have ethics or morality. And that made me think, well, what counts as having ethics or morality? As a trained philosopher, the kind of ethics I read were, our Aristotelian and utilitarian and Kantian and Humean ethics. But if you look at human moral behavior and moral practice, what we actually do that gets called moral behavior goes far beyond those ethical theories from the Western tradition. So I've been interested in reading anthropology and looking across cultures and looking in non-Western religious traditions to see what are the broader sense of ethics, moral practice that we can find among humans, to see if we can formulate a good research question in asking whether there's morality in other species. One of my first attempts at this is to look at social norms in non-human animals and in chimpanzees, because this is the place where this is studied in the context of culture. So culture was often denied for non-human animals. The Japanese primatologists said, hey, look, it seems like these monkeys washing sweet potatoes have a kind of culture. They have this social transmission. One individual does it and others start copying them, and you see this behavior spread to a community. They didn't have to wash the sweet potatoes. They discovered this practice and it spread. It looks like culture. And when the Japanese primatologists took this idea to the West, Western scientists said, oh, that's ridiculous. They're just monkeys. How could they have culture? But then 40 years later, we see papers in nature and science on culture and many different non-human animal species. And by 2020 now, it's pretty widely accepted that we are not the only cultural species. Just to define culture for the audience, culture is understood as the social transmission of a behavior that is innovated by an individual in a community. So you can identify behavior as cultural among a species if you look at different groups of that species living in the wild, and you see the behavior in some of those communities and not in the others. And there's no natural ecological reason for this difference. You assume that somebody innovated this behavior and it was learned. So in chimpanzees are all kinds of learned social behaviors, mostly that have to do with how to get at food, how to get termites, how to get water from lakes using different kinds of sponges and leaves and so on, or how to protect yourself from storms using leaves as umbrellas. But then there are also these kind of less functional behaviors animals engage in that seem to be signaling, maybe signaling fitness or signaling sexual interest or availability that differ from group to group. So the way in some cultures, humans will greet one another by shaking hands, elbow bump. Other cultures, kissing on the cheeks, giving a prayer position. These different greeting practices we also see among different chimpanzee communities. All of this cultural behavior suggests that there might be something like social norms in chimpanzee communities. I have a recent paper out in the Journal of American Philosophical Association where I argue that the relationship between social norms and social cognition is really tight. And we see this evidence for social norms in non-human species, and we see the kind of social cognition that's required to get social norms off the ground, suggests it might be that the norms were in place before the social cognition developed in the sophisticated ways that it did in humans and great apes to require a theory of mind. So a theory of mind in the sense of being able to understand someone's reasons for action, which is richer than the way, Lisa, you used theory of mind earlier, is just seeing another as a minded being with their own inner life or desires and goals and so on and so forth. What humans can do is we can explain why we did what we did, and we can explain why others did what they did, and we can justify our behavior. And these are all getting into moral practices that humans engage in. I'm not suggesting those are moral practices that non-human animals engaged in at this point in their evolutionary history. They're not justifying why they do what they do. This sophisticated theory of mind would have developed because individuals really started needing to explain why they were violating social norms that were already existing. Social norms are, I think, probably pretty widespread in animal kingdoms. Following them and violating them required the development of more sophisticated social cognition.
I think you're connecting innovation with the development of social cognition.
That's right. So when you innovate something, right, you can do that on your own, or you can do that by building on something someone else has done.
If the individual internal blip is something that the other animals see as desirable, I can see how that would lead to not just evolution of the species, but also some characteristics that would then end up being innovated social norms.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because everybody wants it.
That's right. I mean, especially with food, right? Oh, this is a great way to get a lot of ants to eat. Okay, I'm going to do that too. And so you have to spend some time and effort and develop a skill. You need to watch the individual who's good at ant dipping in order to learn how to do it. All of this starts looking a little bit Aristotelian when it comes to ethics. I'm trying to develop and make myself a better ant dipper, maybe a better friend to other people, because I'll let the other chimps come close to me while I ant dip once I've developed this good capacity. It's so interestingly interconnected, the ethics and the social cognition and the social norms. And I'm super excited about continuing to explore this in my current research.
One of the examples that I find so fascinating, trees have an entire way of communicating chemically with each other through this incredible root system that makes them all connected. Even individual plants in the lab. So for instance, if something harms the plant externally, something comes from the external environment, the plant will release a certain chemical that will communicate to the plants around it, danger or something in the environment here, and you need to watch out for it. I could ask, is the plant doing this to alert the rest of its leaves? It's just selfish and it's only doing this, but because other plants speak the same chemical language, they are getting the signal by virtue of the fact that it's there. Or is the plant, or a tree in this case, is it concerned about the family members, the other trees that are connected into its root system? And it has a sense that if the community lives and is healthy, it too will live and be healthy.
The plant research is so fascinating. 20 years ago, people would have laughed at scientists for asking, and now they're really asking these questions. Do plants care about the other plants around them? In order to investigate that question, we'd have to ask a number of things like, do plants recognize individual plants as distinct entities? Bean plants do recognize other bean plants. I think we have to ask whether or not the signals are under voluntary control, whether there's some flexibility. Can plants decide they're not going to signal that there's a predator nearby? If it's impossible, that makes us question whether the plants are actually showing concern. It makes me question that, at least. If anyone could be conservative when talking about plant cognition, it makes me sound a little bit conservative. Usually I like to think of the cognitive flexibility as a real marker of intentionality. And that's what we don't yet have evidence for in the plant. So we know that plants have this great communication system, but it seems to be communication in the biological sense from what we know right now, automatically sending out a signal that's being taken up by a receiver that automatically responds to that and changes its behavior in response. We have just started asking these questions about plants.
If you could make that distinction with a plant, it might make it even harder to say that non-human animals don't have it. They don't have morality. They don't have a sense of something other than just some biologic urge.
So certainly if we saw morality in all life, then pick any one piece of life that you haven't yet looked for morality in, and you'd have a really strong inductive argument that that little piece of life would also have morality. But it could also cut the other way. All right, so people who are skeptical about chimpanzee morality, if you then say, well, then plants have morality too, they'd say, that's not what I'm interested in all. And the chimpanzees are then thrown out of investigation. And I don't want to also claim I have any kind of authority on what counts as morality. But what I think is interesting is that we see in the primates this tendency to change behaviors that are really useful for the individual as an individual. So say a way of cracking nuts that works really well for me my whole life, that I learned from my mom, my community. And then in adolescence, I immigrate to a new community and they don't crack nuts using that effective method. They crack nuts using a worse method, but I'm going to switch to this worse method so I can fit into the new group. That is fascinating.
So is that just for survival, so I don't stick out, or is that some kind of reciprocity? Do they consider that a quote unquote helping behavior? Is there some level of altruism in it because they feel like they want to be part of the group?
Yeah, I know. It's so tricky because we don't even know why humans decided to go with VHS over Betamax. That's probably a very dated reference to a lot of people.
Yes, we do. The camera was so big and so heavy. I actually remember that.
The point I'm trying to make is that we don't know why humans engage in a lot of the social behaviors that they engage in, like helping behaviors. We don't know what makes a human stop and help a person that they see needing help on a street versus a person who walks right by. A person who does stop and help a person in the street probably has a lot of different motives going on at the same time. Pro-social motivations, egocentric motivations, in the right mood at the right time, had time, aren't busy, right? All of these things work together. People try to give kind of debunking explanations of pro-social behavior in non-human animals by saying, oh, it's just egoistic at the end. They're just doing it so that they don't get killed. That might be only part of the story, and it might be part of the story in many of the moral behaviors humans engage in too. Partial motivation for being nice to other people is that if we're nice to other people, we'll have some friends, and we like friends. Friends are fun.
Yeah, but friends, for us, we were very small on the savannah, so we needed to band together as tribes. Having friends is something so deep in our DNA that tells us you must have community in order to survive. I'm not a philosopher. This monkey who left their community, what was going on that they left their community? What was going on in those social relationships? How did that impact the way the monkey was feeling about itself as a being, as a social
Yeah.
creature? And when it showed up in another community, was it now behaving on its own trauma response, trying its best to heal the wounds that it was experiencing? So yes, of course, lots of cognitive researchers would tell me I am being anthropomorphic, I'm ascribing all this to these animals.
I think that the questions you ask are very important questions. So what we know is about chimpanzees is that in adolescence, the females will immigrate from their natal group to a new group. And they do that for genetic diversity. That's not their reason. They don't know about genes, but that's what they do. Your question is, how do they feel when they leave? What is it
Right.
that signals to them that you've got to go now? Is there a traumatic response that they're experiencing when this signal happens and when they leave? How do they feel in the new group? We also know that they're very low ranking when they move into a new group. They don't get to hang out in the center of action. They hang out over on the periphery, and they get closer and closer, and they try to get some guy to like them so that they can be kind of introduced into the group. What does it feel like to do that? Emotion and cognition, both I think are fascinating. Like immigration is ripe for the investigation, both in cognition research and emotion research. In anthropology, certain human groups, marriage practices where females leave their natal group to go move in with their husband's family. And we ask what sort of emotions are female humans experiencing in these sorts of contexts? What are the signals? What is it all like with humans? If we can ask those questions in anthropology about humans, there is no reason why we can't ask these questions in primatology about chimpanzees and other primates who also immigrate. And it would be a fascinating comparative research project. I feel like our whole conversation has been the emergence of great research projects to take up, and I hope somebody does. It would be so cool.
And what you'd really have to be looking at is the effect of patriarchy.
Yeah.
There's a lot of historical evidence that human beings didn't have patriarchal cultures until the late Neolithic. The whole identity that a girl grows up with and the way she's treated all the way along the path. You're just property, and now you have to go be a slave in this other family. This is an entire story of a person's concepts and beliefs of self, their own sense of what kind of intentionality they have as a human being. Your entire self-definition would probably be that you're just an object for the use of others.
I mean, that's so interesting in thinking about the sense of self that a chimpanzee might have, especially a chimpanzee female at that point of immigration, that her definition of self might have very much to do with who decides to accept her in which male. Making comparisons with zoo chimpanzees when they reach adolescence, because there's nowhere to go, would be one way to look. And another way to look would be to compare chimpanzees with bonobos, who have a very different social structure. They have a matriarchal social structure. So many good research questions. Oh.
No wonder you do the consciousness of animal minds. It's so fascinating. You're so fortunate. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you think is really important?
No. Is there something else you think we should talk about?
I have to say, I am kind of curious, just because the nature of the academic world of philosophy, it's so male dominated. I'm just curious how it's been for you in your journey as a woman in this field, by the way, doing something that frankly is just so cutting edge.
Yeah, I haven't had the best stories being a woman in philosophy. I had my mentor tell me he could marry me. I had one of my first bosses hit on me at the photocopy machine a few weeks after I got my first job. This is just academic philosophy. My first book didn't get a lot of citations. Maybe it was terrible, but the ideas emerged. I was fighting against the mainstream views about folk psychology at the time. I was challenging this idea that our folk psychological understanding was either theory-like or simulation-like. I thought that was a false dichotomy, didn't reflect the pluralism involved in how we understand each other. Nobody wanted to publish that. I did get the book published, which was really heartbreaking amount of work and discouraging at many points. It didn't get a lot of attention. It didn't get reviewed very widely. But I see these ideas now emerging much more broadly among people coming from different perspectives. Some people coming from more of an embodied mind perspective are making similar points to the points I made. That's good. I'm really happy that the ideas are getting out there. I work really hard at promoting young philosophers. A lot of the people who are working in the philosophy of animal minds are women. And since women don't often get their voices amplified and tend to be less willing to amplify their own voices, I've worked very hard trying to amplify their voices on Twitter and Facebook and in interviews like this.
The other thing I thought I would ask you about, it's the supersession of cognitive neuroscience over philosophy. How this has been for you as a philosopher.
Yeah, it's been really different for me. I mean, in part because I don't do neuroscience, and the comparative psychologists I work with primarily don't do neuroscience either. So there's a lot of comparative psychology that is involved in neuroscience. I work with scientists who are looking at behavior, natural behavior in field contexts a lot of the times. I have been welcomed with open arms by scientists. Philosophers have become more and more open to understanding that there are basic descriptions of animal behavior that are really relevant to the kinds of generalizations that they were so happy to make, or thought experiments that they were happy to perform that didn't take into account real life facts about humans or non-human animals, frankly. I really feel like I've walked into this field at a time where philosophers have been more open to science and scientists have been more open to philosophers. Perfect storm of opportunity that's allowed for the development of the philosophy of animal minds as a field. So I feel super lucky.
Well, I feel super lucky to have met you. It was so random that we met, Frank.
I know, it was great. Well, this is why, despite climate change costs and despite worries about viruses, actually going physically places and talking to people, nothing's going to replace that. And it breaks my heart that nothing's going to replace that. We can have this conversation now because we met, but we would have never had it had we not just been in the same place at the same time eating breakfast.
I agree. If people want to get in touch with you or find out more about your work, I know you have a website. Do you want to give the information for that?
You can find many of my published papers online at my website, www.kristinandrews.org. You can also follow me on Twitter at Kristin Andrews with a Z, because Kristin Andrews with an S was already taken.
This has been so incredibly informative. I learned so much. And thank you so much for being willing to talk philosophy with a non-philosopher.
Such a pleasure, Lisa. Your questions are so interesting. And I really do think we did some brainstorming of cool new research projects in this conversation. So thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's show. To get in touch, please visit groundlessground.com. Let's dedicate our efforts to the healing of our planet and all its inhabitants. See you next time on the Groundless Ground.